been talking for the last several weeks about different interpretations of Genesis chapter 1. Last time we looked at the gap interpretation, which says that between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, there is a great time gap during which there was a prehistoric world, a world of organisms and perhaps even civilizations that was judged by God and destroyed, and then Genesis 1 and verse 2 describes God's recreation of the world. And I suggested that there's nothing in the text to suggest that verse 2 is merely a recreation. This interpretation seems to be, I said, an example of concordism at its very worst, namely under the pressure of the scientific evidence for geological time and prehistoric life, one reads into the text things that aren't really there. Well, let's go on now to the day gap interpretation. The day gap interpretation, this is somewhat different. The day gap interpretation holds that what we have described in Genesis chapter 1 is 6 24-hour but non-consecutive days. 6 literal 24-hour days, but they are not consecutive days. Rather, there are long gaps of time in between God's creative acts. So, for example, on one day, God miraculously creates, for example, the birds. And then there's this long period of time during which God allows the birds to propagate. They bear after their kinds. And then he intervenes again on another creative day and miraculously creates, for example, land animals. And then he allows them to propagate for a long period of time after their kinds until he intervenes again. So you have 6 24-hour creative days, but they are separated by great periods of time. What might one say by way of assessment of this theory? Well, again, I think we have to say that there's nothing in the text that would suggest the day gap interpretation. There's nothing in the text that would indicate that there are gaps of time in between these 6 days. It seems to me that the clear motivation behind this interpretation is to try to reconcile the text with geological time and limited evolutionary development of life forms. You read gaps into the text in between the days so as to extend the past as far as geological evidence indicates it needs to be, and then you can allow for limited evolution of the kinds during those gaps. And insofar as this view then tends to be motivated by an attempt to reconcile Genesis chapter 1 with the discoveries of modern science, I think that what we have here is an example of the hermeneutic of concordism, once again, which I think is eisegesis, not exegesis. It's reading into the text rather than out of the text. Ironically, it needs to be said as well that it really doesn't do a very good job at reconciling the text with modern science in any case, because modern science indicates that the animals, for example, were not created in just a 24-hour period of time. They were created over millions of years. Even the so-called Cambrian explosion wasn't something that happened in a 24-hour day, but over vast periods of geological time. So the idea that all aquatic life, for example, was created in 24 hours, and then there was this long period of non-creative development, and then there was another 24-hour period during which all terrestrial life was created, just flies in the face of the fossil record. So insofar as this day gap interpretation is motivated by a desire to find concord with modern science, it really doesn't do a very good job, frankly. But that is beside the point, actually, for the hermeneutical project that we're engaged in at this stage. We're simply asking the hermeneutical question: what does the text mean? And I think we have to say that the day gap interpretation doesn't really find any support in the text. It's a view that is read into the text. Any comments on the day gap interpretation?
How does the day gap interpretation resolve day 4 with the creation of the sun? Being separated from the
It
vegetation.
really wouldn't seem to do anything for that, would it? Because you would still have that being created in a 24-hour day. That they would probably have to interpret that again in the way that some young earthers have, namely the clearing of the cloud canopy or something else where the sun now appears. But you're right, merely having gaps wouldn't help with that problem.
How prevalent is this view? I've never really heard it being purported.
I don't think that it's very prevalent, though it has been proposed. We're just trying to survey the various options here,
Sure.
and this would be one. Actually, I guess I heard when I was in college that it was suggested by some progressive creationists that it would be a way to try to get geological time and limited evolution. You could accommodate the evidence for microevolutionary change without denying 24-hour periods of time. But I can't really think of any modern advocates of this view today.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, let's go to the day-age interpretation, which is one that has been more widely held. The day-age interpretation is one that has been suggested by a number of church fathers and other commentators down through history. And it holds that the 24-hour days, or rather that the days are not literal 24-hour periods of time, but rather these days are in fact long periods of time of unspecified duration. Though they're called days, they're not actually days, they're long time periods, ages. So that what you have in the text is actually the description of God's creation of life over 6 successive ages of indeterminate length. Now, as I pointed out, we do have in the text some suggestions that the days are not necessarily literal. You'll recall what I had to say about God's creation of the vegetation and the fruit trees on the 3rd day, where God commands the earth to bring forth these plants. And we probably would be imagining things if we thought that the author thought this was like a film being run on fast forward that all happened in a 24-hour period of time. So I think there is some indication in the text that these days are not necessarily literal. On the other hand, the idea that the text intends us to take these days as 6 consecutive ages, especially ages of equal duration, is again something that's being read into the text rather than being read out of the text. I think there are indications in the text that the days may not be literal, but that doesn't mean that it's intended to describe 6 consecutive ages, especially of equal duration. In fact, again, insofar as those who propose the day-age interpretation are motivated by modern science to embrace this view, it really still doesn't fit with what modern science says in many respects. For example, the evidence doesn't support the view that certain forms of life did not appear on the scene until the previous age was over. It's not as though you had to wait for one age to be complete before the animals or the plants in the next age came into existence. To give a specific example, according to the scientific evidence, terrestrial life appeared long before birds appeared on the scene. And yet the text has birds being created during the 3rd age prior to the creation of land animals in the 4th age, so that you actually had birds before you had terrestrial life. And that is completely contrary to the fossil record and the scientific evidence. Now, some interpreters have tried to escape this difficulty by saying that perhaps the ages here are not really consecutive ages. Maybe they're overlapping, so that, for example, you would have age 1 here, and then you would have age 2, which might begin midway through age 1, and then age 3, and then age 4, so that you could have animals appearing midway through the previous age, even though they're described as being in the succeeding age. But I think we have to say that this hypothesis is clearly a contrivance, which is trying to save the accuracy of the text and bring it into line with modern scientific evidence. It would be hopeless to try to discern in the text itself any suggestion that these days or ages are not consecutive, not one after another, but somehow begin in the middle of each other and continue. It's clearly, again, trying to read modern science back into the text and to make the text conform to modern science. So while I would say that the day-age view is certainly a possibility, it's a possibility that the author did want us to think of this as 6 consecutive ages. Nevertheless, apart from the fact that the days aren't necessarily literal, there really isn't much support in the text for thinking that the days are meant to represent ages. So if there are other interpretations that take the days non-literally as well, we'll have to compare the day-age interpretation with these other non-literal interpretations to try to discern which one is the most plausible interpretation of the text. But merely saying that the days aren't literal doesn't itself imply that the author intended us here to be thinking of 6 consecutive ages during which things were created on earth. Any comments or discussion about that day-age interpretation? Yeah, Donald, down here in the front.
Maybe you're going to come to it, but I understand as the verse reads, and there was a beginning, or the morning and then the evening, right? It says
Yes,
after the
there
first
was evening and there was morning.
evening and the morning. I've read that can mean that there's a beginning of the age or time, and there was an ending of the time.
Yeah.
So that kind of shoots this steps idea or
Oh, you mean so when it says there was evening and there was morning,
it seems to
that would suggest this is the evening, right? And so the morning of the next age would begin right after it.
Right.
That would seem to be the natural interpretation. If I understand Donald correctly, he's saying when you have age 1, then it says, and it was evening, and it was morning, one day. And then the next day starts, and then it was evening, and it was morning, and then that was day the next day. And so the ages look consecutive, don't they? I think clearly this idea, though clever, is really ad hoc or contrived. The natural language, I think, would be such as Donald has said.
Okay, so you are agreeing that there isn't a kind of end point, a beginning point and an end point?
Right. It does. They look like consecutive ages. If these are ages, they would look consecutive to me, and not this sort of staggered set of ages.
The thought occurred to me, the Sabbath starts when?
In the evening.
Right. Not the morning.
Right.
So it goes from evening to morning, right?
Yes.
Is that why the Jewish faith took that position? Is because of what the scripture said about evening and morning?
Well, I would say it's rather the reverse. I think the reason that the Genesis narrative is written in terms of it was evening and it was morning is because this reflects the later Jewish ritual way of counting days, where the day starts at 6 p.m. in the evening with the setting of the sun, and then it ends the next day at the setting of the sun. So the days don't run as we think of in the morning at dawn. It goes in a sense from dusk to dusk, rather than from morning to morning as we do in our Western culture.
But
And the narrative reflects that practice.
okay, you're saying that the Jewish people basically believe that the day starts at sundown.
Right.
Okay.
Wasn't Genesis 1 written before there were Jewish people?
Well, this is a question of authorship on which I'm not taking any sort of stand. Traditionally, this is ascribed to Moses. The traditional authorship of the Pentateuch is ascribed to Moses. So in that sense, it would be after Abraham. Yes, there would be Jewish people at this time.
I thought that the authorship of Genesis was not ascribed to Moses, that it was ascribed, again, back to the tablet, the Toledoth. It was ascribed as a series of Toledoths or
That's
biographies.
just the generations.
The generations, yes, exactly. It's ascribed in the book itself. It says these were the days of Adam, and they wrote these tablets. They've discovered these tablets in the Middle East, and each of these tablets wrote the generation and their account of what happened. And that's why it looks like there's repetitiveness, because you get one description of the generation, and then the next author writes a little bit about it. It looks like
Yeah.
there's repetitiveness.
Well, when you look at the way New Testament authors quote the Old Testament Pentateuch, the first 5 books, they will often say, as Moses said, or when Moses is read, and they're thinking of this as being ascribed to Moses. But that isn't inconsistent with saying that Moses had sources and traditions, maybe oral traditions, upon which he relied in writing. So the date of the original Genesis account is not one that I'm taking any sort of stand on in terms of when it was actually written. Liberal scholars would date it much later, but to say it's Mosaic would be a conservative position that would put it very early rather than later in the history of Israel. But in either case, there would certainly be a Jewish people here that would tell this story.
Well, I mean, not until after Abraham and I really think that Moses couldn't have written this unless he had sources. So I mean, unless he made it up, and so he's got sources from this. So the authors of the sources were clearly not Moses, and it was clearly before there were Jewish people.
Then
So
the question would
that's
be,
why I
Brad,
question that.
And I think this is a really, really important question that Old Testament scholars debate vociferously, the sources for Genesis. You would have to then to try to discern which elements in the narrative represent the sources and which represent the editorial work of the final redactor or the editor and so forth. And that is really a controverted question. There are source theories about Genesis which we're simply not getting into, because we're asking about how do we interpret the text as we have it, rather than trying to discern these traditions that may have lain behind it, which is very, very controverted and difficult. All right, with that, we need to draw to a close. And next time, we'll look at the next interpretation, which is called the Revelation Day interpretation.